My name is Charles Blue. I'm with the Association for Psychological Science. I would like to welcome you to this expert panel on policing and racism, insights from psychological science. This is the second in our series of panel discussions about the psychological science impact on the study of racism and bias. So the panel today is going to focus on this topic. Before we started, I earlier this morning took a look at the various news stories that came out in the past 24 hours that are actually relevant to the topic of this talk. It was actually a very easy thing to do from simply just going through our search to find just these stories in a matter of 24 hours. If I were to go back a week, it would be way too much work. So this demonstrates that this is a daily concern, an ongoing concern. And even today, the Associated Press poll about police violence remaining high concern in the US was just released a few hours ago. So speaking to these issues, we have our four panelists. I first will introduce Jennifer Eberhardt, who's professor of psychology and co-director of Social Psychology Answers to Real-World Questions, or SPARQ, at Stanford University. Jennifer is also the president-elect of APS and will be inaugurated APS president next week. Then I have Philip Adebagoff, who is co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policy Equity and a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale University. Following him will be Keith Payne, a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And finally, we will hear from Tom Tyler, the Macklin Fleming Professor of Law and a professor of psychology at Yale Law School.
I'm Jennifer Eberhardt. I'm from Stanford University, and it's just a pleasure to be with you today. Many have noted that we are in a period of racial unrest. And they point to the killing of George Floyd as the spark that ignited that racial reckoning. Yet way before the summer of protests that spread across the country, the Pew Research Center released a report which found that 6 in 10 Americans rated race relations in this country as generally bad. And a majority of Americans feared that things were getting worse. They feared we were slipping back in time. So as a nation, we were already struggling to hang on. And I conduct research to speak to that struggle. I'm here today to talk about bias. Racial bias can get activated in a wide variety of contexts. And today I want to focus on criminal justice. I want to focus on this association between African Americans and crime, which has deep roots in our culture. With a number of colleagues, I've conducted studies for the past 20 plus years demonstrating its power. We found that African Americans are so associated with crime that the mere presence of a Black face can cause people to see weapons better. In a typical study, we invite undergraduates into our lab. We'd have them sit in front of a computer screen with the focus dot at the center, and then they would see flashes of light appear around that focus dot. Now, these flashes were actually the faces of young men that were appearing at such a rapid rate on the computer screen that participants couldn't consciously detect them. And here it is again in slow motion. So we use what's called a subliminal priming procedure to expose some of our study participants to an entire series of Black male faces. And then, or we had another group of participants where we exposed them to an entire series of white male faces. And we found that simple exposure to Black male faces enhanced their ability to detect guns from blurry images. Bias can not only control what we see, but where we look. Prompting people to think of violent crime can lead them to look toward a Black face and away from a white face. Prompting police officers to think of shooting or arresting or capturing can lead their eyes to settle on Black faces too. A police officer once told me a story that really struck me. He was working undercover and he saw a guy in the distance near a huge office tower with glass walls. And this guy looked similar to the officer in some ways. So he was African American. He was about the same build, same height. But what was different was that this guy had a scruffy beard. His hair was uncombed. He looked disheveled. He also looked like he was armed and dangerous. So as they were approaching each other, the officer had an uneasy feeling. And when the officer reaches the office building, he loses sight of the man and then he starts to panic. But then he sees this guy again walking inside the building. Now, the officer is still on the outside, but he could see the guy out of the corner of his eye. And when the officer walked faster, this guy would walk faster too. And when the officer slowed down, he would slow down too. And so the officer decided to stop cold and confront the guy face to face. And when the officer looked him in the eye, a chill went through him. He realized that he was staring at himself. He was the person he feared. He was staring at his own reflection through the mirrored wall. That entire time, the officer was profiling himself. Bias can make its way into the courtroom as well. It can affect how we punish. It can even play a role in death sentencing decisions. In a large data set of death-eligible defendants, we found that looking more Black more than doubled the chances that those defendants would receive a death sentence, at least when their victims were white. And this effect is significant, even though we control for factors like aggravators and mitigators, we control for the severity of the crime, we even control for the defendant's attractiveness. And no matter what we control for, Black defendants appear to be punished in proportion to the Blackness of their physical features. The more Black, the more death worthy. So what do we do? What do we do when racial bias can be absorbed and acted upon, whether we're sitting in front of a computer screen or walking up a street or deliberating in a courtroom? What do we do? And I want to argue here that although racial bias can touch our lives in so many ways, we are not doomed to be under its grip. We're all vulnerable to bias, but we don't act on bias all the time. Instead, bias is triggered by the situations we find ourselves in. And as researchers, we know a lot about what those situational triggers are. Responding quickly is a trigger for bias. Using subjective standards to evaluate others, that's a trigger for bias. Lack of accountability, lack of training, the list goes on and on here. Even our emotional states matter. Cultural norms matter. So this is where bias happens. And these situational triggers are at work not only within us as individuals, they're at work at a systemic level as well. So let me give you an example. Here in California, I and a number of my colleagues work with members of the Oakland Police Department to help them to reduce the number of stops they were making. And this is of people who were not committing any serious crimes. And we did this by simply pushing officers to ask themselves a question before each and every stop they made. And that question was, is this stop intelligence-led? Yes or no? In other words, the officer had to think, do I have prior information, prior intelligence to tie this particular person to a specific crime? And if they determined that the stop was intel-led, they had to list the source of that intelligence. So this procedure forces officers to pause and think, why am I considering pulling this person over? Now, the year before adding that question to the form officers complete during a stop, they made about 32,000 stops across the city. That following year, with the addition of this intel-led question, that dropped to about 19,000 stops. African-American stops alone fell by over 43%. And this drop happened even as the crime rate continued to fall. So stopping fewer Black people did not make the city any more dangerous. In fact, it made it safer for everybody. So how did this intervention work? Well, bias is triggered when we're responding quickly. So we introduced friction. That is, we slowed officers down. We changed the standards of evaluation, pushing them to use their intelligence in place of their intuition. We increased accountability by introducing a metric to track these intel-led stops. The department defined what an intel-led stop was and then trained officers on how to spot it. And then the police leadership encouraged these kinds of stops. They changed the norms for what good policing looked like. Is this stop intelligence-led? It sounds like a pretty simple question. Yet there are a lot of psychological principles baked into it. And when we understand the factors that trigger bias, it opens up a huge array of interventions to mitigate it. We've also been able to examine what happens when police officers do make contact with people. By best estimates, about 12% of US drivers are stopped by police each year, and that's millions of drivers. And these interactions are consequential. They are the context through which trust is built or eroded on a daily basis. And until now, we didn't really have a good way of observing how officers communicate with the public. But with the spread of body-worn cameras, we now have access to how these interactions unfold in real time. The footage from these cameras allows us to look for patterns across many interactions, and this lets us test the extent to which there are differences in the respect officers communicate to Black and white drivers. So with an interdisciplinary team of researchers at Stanford, we've begun to look at this. We captured footage from nearly 1,000 traffic stops, and we used machine learning techniques to comb through the words that officers used during these stops. And we found that even when officers were behaving professionally, they spoke to Black drivers with less respect than white drivers. They used more formal titles with white drivers. They expressed more concern for the safety of white drivers, and they offered more reassurance to white drivers. They let them know it'll be okay, it'll be all right. In fact, based on the words officers used alone, we could predict whether that officer was talking to a Black person or a white person. In more recent studies with a completely different data set, we're finding that we can use the first 45 words that an officer utters to predict whether that encounter is going to escalate, whether the person stopped is going to be handcuffed, searched, or arrested. And we can do this with 83% accuracy. So if we're looking for ways to change systems, this is low-hanging fruit. Most law enforcement agencies, especially the large agencies, they have cameras, right? Yet the vast majority of that footage from these cameras, it's never examined. So how can we expect cameras to serve as an accountability tool when the footage is not analyzed, when that footage is not even treated as data? And this has implications far beyond traffic stops. We can use this footage to examine how no-knock warrants are executed on Black versus white suspects. We can look at how witness statements are taken. We can look at interrogation practices. We can look at training. In fact, the Oakland Police Department invited us to present the takeaways of our findings in a training on traffic stops. And we're now looking at footage pre and post training to see whether that training made a difference for real interactions on the street. So you ask, what can we do? You now know that we have many mitigation tools at our disposal to fight bias. We have tools we can use to fight the mere threat of bias. And we can use these same tools to increase fairness and justice. We can leverage science so that we don't slip back in time, so that we continue to strive to see one another, so that we continue to strive to see ourselves. Thank you.
Okay. Can everybody see that? Thank you for the thumbs. Thank you, Charles. Always nice to be here with good friends, Jennifer, Keith, Tom, Charles, new friends. And thank you all for being here and listening. It's always also wonderful to see Jennifer. Usually I prefer to see her going after me so that I don't have to follow her. Manage your expectations. All right. So as Charles said, my name is Philip Atiba Goff. I am the Carl I. Hovland Professor of African American Studies and Professor of Psychology at Yale. And I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity. And in both of those capacities, I'll be talking about how we ask the right questions about racism in policing. for this APS panel. So I got 4 goals to talk about in the limited time that I've got. Jennifer, how did you manage to go under 15 minutes? You're the first academic ever to use less time. So again, unable to follow that. My first goal will be to introduce you to the center. Those of you who don't know what we do at the end, maybe you'll know some of the things. The second thing will be to specify the right level of analysis, because I think part of the reason why we're here is because psychologists have tried to analyze this problem at a psychological level, and that is important, and it cannot be the only way we talk about it. The third goal is to show some science, some elements of some things. It's just one study I want to show you about that mostly demonstrate that if we don't bother to look, there's all kinds of problems we haven't even begun to explore. So as bad as things are, they're in some ways worse. That means all the solutions that we've got, we need to make them even better. And goal 4 is to give you some examples, as Jennifer did, of some promising work, some things we can do. I'm going to subdivide that into the harm reduction work, redesign work, and implementation. All right. Normally, if we were in person, I'd ask whether or not that made any sense to you. I'm usually talking about how I'm not in a Black church, but I'm of the Black church. I do a little call and response. I'm going to pretend that you're saying all those things back to me so that I can be comfortable. And we'll move right on to goal 1. Let me tell you about the Center for Policing Equity. So our mission at the Center for Policing Equity is to make policing less deadly, less racist, and less present where it doesn't need to be. It was founded formally in 2008 after a 2007 conference that some Black woman named Jennifer, who won a MacArthur Award, put together at Stanford University, that I was lucky enough to go to as her former graduate student. We leverage social science for better outcomes. So it's exactly the goal of what I got taught in graduate school, to take what we're understanding in the science and to translate that into better policy that affects people's lives. And importantly, in this day and age, we have since 2008 received no funding for or from policing in the process of what we do. We're funded entirely by federal and philanthropic grants, as well as the kindness of individual small dollar donors. So at the center, which we constructed to be this interlocutor between law enforcement and science, we have built the largest research and action organization around police and race in the world. It's a super humble brag. As everybody on this panel can tell you, before a number of years ago, this was not an area that was particularly popular. There was not a particular policy emphasis on it. In fact, when we were screaming, saying there needed to be something, there weren't a lot of folks who were listening. At the center, we also host the NSF-funded National Justice Database, which is the largest collection of police behavioral data in the world. Also a slightly less humble brag, but as you heard from Jim Comey when he was head of the FBI, it's an embarrassment. The federal government does not collect behavioral data on policing, which is why we know things about crime, but not things that we do in response to it. The way we work is before the summer of 2020, we engaged in harm reduction for vulnerable communities, where we imagined there was power to deliver. We worked with law enforcement and communities to make policing better. This intervention model worked with policing communities to produce those better outcomes. But after 2020, we work increasingly directly with electeds and communities to create the conditions so that communities can take care of and keep themselves safe. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about the right level of analysis. Let me talk about that because I think it's maybe the most important thing I can say to the psychologists who are listening. And I'll start with this statement. Racism is not an audit test. So in the context of policing, here's kind of what I mean. There are 3 levels that we want to think about. Level of the encounter, the level of community, and the level of the city or larger. For those of you who studied anything outside of psychology, you'll recognize this as a micro, a meso, and a macro level of analysis. And here's what that looks like in the context of policing. Encounter level racism is when you have one police officer. By the way, the clip art around this is terrible, so I will not be blamed for this. One police officer who treats one group of people who look one way or of one color differently than another group. So if this one police officer, we'll call this officer friendly, treats all of the purple people negatively and all of the red people positively, that's the kind of racism we're used to. Individual level, encounter level racism. If the purple people were Black and the red people were white, we understand this all the time, as if the officer's level decision is the problem. But that's not the only level on which racism functions. So now Officer Friendly treats everyone within the community where he goes exactly the same. And sometimes he's assigned to a Black community or a community where majority of the folks are Black. There's white people who live there, Asian folks who live there, Latinx folks who live there, Native folks who live there, right? But everybody in this majority Black neighborhood gets treated the same. And then a different Officer Friendly treats everybody who lives in a majority white neighborhood the same. There are Black people who live there, Native folks, Latinx folks. But if the Black neighborhood, majority Black neighborhood gets treated negatively, the majority white neighborhood gets treated positively, we still on the aggregate have racial disparity. And because policing is so localized, if we don't engage this meso-level factor, we're missing out on a lot. But if you've studied policing, then you understand there are some researchers who do this, not mostly in psychology, but there are researchers in sociology, demography, economics who do this. Oftentimes we miss the macro. So imagine you have a group of officers that police everybody in the city the exact same way. Let's say take the greatest city in the history of the world, Philadelphia. I happen to be there, but that's just a coincidence. We say everybody in the city of Philadelphia gets treated the same way, and everybody in the city of, let's say, Bridgeport, nearby where I live right now, gets treated the same way. Well, because we know what the demographics of Philadelphia and the demographics of Bridgeport are, Bridgeport, Connecticut, if everybody in Philadelphia gets treated worse than everybody in Bridgeport, we still have racial disparities. And we oftentimes don't talk about those different levels where that's happening. So the psychologist's job within this context is to specify which level of analysis to include those other levels of analysis in our thinking and talk about the psychological factors that influence behavior at each level and the psychological consequences at each level. Now, for social psychologists, our focus is likely to be on those first two levels, right? Our job then is to identify the common situations in both of those levels, as exactly as Jennifer did just before, to study those situations, to compare to prejudice as a predictor, and then to find interventions. And the interventions can just be that manipulation that you have in the lab that you take out into the world. So with that conceptual framework, let me move on to talking just a little bit about the science that we've been doing at the Center for Policing Equity. I'm just going to give you one example to show you what happens when we start looking in places where previously we thought there was no reason to look. We're looking at the chronic situation of exposure to members of a vulnerable category. So this is work that I've done in collaboration with CPE's Senior Vice President of Science, Tracy Lloyd. And here we're extending on work that we did on who gets to be a child. So we had done this work previously, as had Sandra Graham, and Brian Lowry, Anita Ratan, with somebody on this call as well. You guys see the heavy Eberhardt influence on all of my work. And what we found was that Black children are seen as older, less innocent, and more responsible for their actions. Right? This is in the context of policing. This is in the context of policing as a situational factor, where the more it is likely that a child has engaged in something illegal, the older they got treated to be. But what does that mean out there in the actual world? Now, I've got one study in that 2014 paper that looks at it out in the actual world, but we wanted to go broader. So we examined 9 cities for use of force rates, and we compared by race and age. Here we're collapsing across gender and some other categories. We're looking at race and age. We're looking at Black and white, adults and children. Children just defined as under 18. And here we're able in these 9 cities to benchmark against race age arrests. So all of these rates are benchmarked against the arrest rates for that race and age category for white adults, white children, Black adults, Black children. And what we expected in this study was simply that childhood would be protective, but more for white children than for Black children. Again, 9 cities looking at use of force benchmarked against the race and age arrest rate. And we do that to get a sense of, all right, well, how much are they likely to come into contact with law enforcement for something that maybe they did? We understand that that's not a perfect benchmark, but you'll see it doesn't prevent us from seeing some pretty distressing things. So normally I would show you some complex hierarchical regressions because that's my jam, but sometimes descriptive science is the best way to go. So all I'm going to show you is the child to adult force ratios. That's the first one. I'm going to show you three slides. So children on top, adults on the bottom of this fraction, right? And we want the number to be small because that means adults are more likely to face force in these 9 cities than are children. I'm going to show you white in the dark blue and Black in the light blue. And what you'll see is that child to adult force ratio is about 0.41 for white folks and more than twice that for Black folks. And again, this is out in the world. We're using actual use of force data from the 9 police departments. What about the more traditional Black to white force ratio? Nationwide, this is about a 4-to-1 force ratio, especially when controlling for these factors. But these 9 cities, they're particularly progressive. They use force less than the national average. What are we going to see here? Well, it turns out here, we're going to see a little less. Black on top, white below. Instead of 4-to-1, Black to white, we saw 1.64 to 1. for the adults, which is usually what we're looking at when we're looking at national stats. But it was more than double. The racial disparity was more than double for Black to white children. Now, all of that is distressing to me, but none so much as this next finding. It's a kind of finding that reminds me again of graduate school. Forgive me for being back in here. When we were first looking at the Black Ape Association, when understanding that, in fact, people literally implicitly associated Black folks with apes. It makes you sit and think. Because we thought that childhood would be protective, just less so for Black children than for white children. But next, what I'm going to show you is the median use of force per 1,000 residents within a race age category. I'm just going to show you two. I'm going to show you white adults and Black children. And what we see is that per 1,000, we've got 12 use of forces for white adults and 14.6 for Black children. What I'm showing you here is evidence that in these 9 cities, whiteness is more protective than childhood. It's not something I would have predicted. It's not something that I think that folks who do developmental psychology or perceptions of children would have predicted. And yet we find it when we bother to look, which means we need to have innovative solutions for bigger than the problems that we collectively understand, because we have not begun to investigate the problems at the depth at which they occur. Normally, I just leave you like this, but it turns out I'm under time. So I get to talk to you just a little bit about something that's good news, some promising work that the Center for Policing Equity has been up next to helping communities do in the last several years, particularly in this last year. So I'm going to start with harm reduction, which we take as language from the language of public health, right? So in public health, we talk about harm reduction in the context of addiction, right? If you can't get somebody to quit their addiction, if they can't cease taking an illicit substance that's doing bad things to their health and their behavior, you want to keep them alive long enough that they get the chance to try over and over again, right? That's harm reduction. In this context, we think about harm reduction as this nation's addiction to punishment. And in the context of that, the work we've been doing has been following what law enforcement's been doing for quite some time. Some of the greatest gains in crime reduction through policing have been through the simple application of performance management. Anybody who's ever heard of CompStat understands that that's data police collect to hold themselves accountable to crime. And it turns out it does reduce crimes. It can be used to help reduce crimes. So we use this, the science that's been done around this, particularly Andrew Gelman's model, along with Jeff Fagan, to replicate that same performance management element, but with the goal not of reducing crime, but of reducing injustice. Because through these statistical methods, which again, I'm happy to show you all of the extra nerd work at another point, what we can do is we can try and separate out the segment of racial disparities that belongs to police behavior and police policy, and the portion of that belongs to education or employment or to healthcare. The portion that they can do something about and the portion that they can't. When you give that data back to communities and to law enforcement, they can optimize to that in the same way that every organization optimizes to everything they've ever measured. So we've got about 60 plus jurisdictions. I think we're at 63 right now in partnership in this. And on average, where we have pre and post data, we see a reduction of arrests by 25%, of use of force by 26%, of officer-related injuries by 13%. Now that's just pre and post. So we're looking forward to seeing in a causal way what portion of that is the intervention. I'm not talking causality here, but pre and post, that's better than nothing right now. Better than a stick in the eye, a poke in the eye with a sharp stick, right? That's the harm reduction side. Let me give you a little bit on the redesign side. This is the work on reimagining public safety and how you move from reimagining to redesigning. So this summer in July, we put out a roadmap for redesigning public safety, a bunch of things that folks could do to shrink the footprint of law enforcement into the places where both law enforcement and community said, we don't want to be. So here, I think we're at about 66 departments, jurisdictions that have used this through the Obama Foundation. We put this out. It was a way to start thinking about less systems of punishment at a time where we understand that's good, but it's scary because the murder rate is spiking across the country. What folks have done with that is it has empowered those who are worried about violence to reduce the footprint of law enforcement through an evidence-based metric. It says, measure this first, this second, this third, and if you're still scared, go to the community, see what the community wants. We've been really excited to see people take that up. And particularly in places where we've worked even more closely. Places like Berkeley, California, where they've recently moved to eliminate low-level traffic enforcement by police, right? Not just a decline to prosecute as has been done in other places like Baltimore. In Nassau County, where they've redesigned 911, they've removed officers from schools, and they've ended the armed response to all nonviolent infraction. In both of those places, we helped with those plans, and we led with the evidence. And most important to me, I think maybe the professional accomplishment I'm most proud of happened this past April in Ithaca and Tompkins County. The state decided they wanted to have everybody come up with a new plan for reimagining. And in Ithaca and Tompkins County, they said, we don't want to do anything incremental. We want to do something that fits the moment. So they moved for a resolution to dissolve their police department and replace it with a Department of Community Solutions and Public Safety. That new department will be civilian-led, majority unarmed. They will not send any armed responders to nonviolent incidents. It will have a public health orientation and public health resources to create proactive investments in prevention. And the reason I tell you that story is not just because it's a story of pretty significant change of the kind I never thought I would see, but it's at this last part. Because there was widespread expectations of the police union, as they often do, would sue to stop this plan. Of course, we're going to dissolve the police department, the union would sue, as they frequently do. But the Monday before the vote, the Police Benevolent Association ended up publicly endorsing elements of the plan and not resisting it publicly in any way. I don't expect we're going to be able to do that again, but it does bear repeating. This is what can happen when communities are armed with science, so they can trust a process when they can't trust each other. So let me get off the stage and give it up to folks who are both more compelling to watch and have interesting science results to get to. I just want to make sure that we get, after Amadou Diallo, after that tremendously tragic incident where an individual holding up a wallet got shot at 41 times by NYPD because they thought it was a gun, and it revolutionized the ability to talk about implicit bias. We're past the point where just those split decisions are the things where psychologists owe a responsibility to communities. We have to take the broader context of policing seriously, and we can, because it's not all bias is implicit. And racism is more than psychology. But as you're going to hear today, psychology plays a role at how we reorient policing within that context. When we have the broader context in mind, we can specify what it is we're supposed to do, and we can deliver on that in a way that doesn't shrink the problem, but is responsive to it. All right, let me stop talking, give this back to Charles, who can give this to Keith.
My name is Keith Payne. I'm a psychology professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I want to pick up on one of the themes that Professor Goff brought up and expand upon it a little bit in my talk. I'm going to not talk a lot about policing directly, but I'm going to take a step back and talk about some of the psychological and social dynamics that set the context for inequalities and bias in policing. So to tell you what I'm going to tell you before I tell you, we've had a lot of broadening of the conversation in our society in the last couple of years around two terms. One, implicit bias. It's become more of a household word. And the other one is systemic racism. Before George Floyd's killing, people outside of the academy didn't use those words very often. But now they've percolated into a much broader kind of conversation. What I want to argue is that these are not necessarily two entirely separate things. In fact, they might be two aspects of the same problem. So for the last 25 years or so, implicit bias has been studied in our labs and in lots of other settings, mainly as an individual attitude, something in our heads like a belief or a preference that we carry around with us. What I'm going to argue is that in addition to that, it might actually be a better reflection of the social environments we inhabit, not just the thoughts in our heads, right? So if that's the case, then what it means is that we need to change our thinking from trying to educate or persuade or train people out of their individual attitudes, and more toward trying to modify the social environments and the structures and the settings and the systems around us. So to begin, the standard narrative that we tell about implicit bias, both in the classroom within universities and when we talk to journalists, goes something like this. So we're all born in a society that has stereotypes and inequalities, and we learn those stereotypes really early. We soak it up from our culture as children. And because we learn that and practice it so much over the course of many years growing up, it becomes this really rigid bias, this attitude that's difficult to change. And we have lots of studies in psychology showing that it's difficult to change them. And if you do change them, they seem to snap right back. And yet, even though it's difficult to change implicit biases, the story goes, they're very important because there are individual differences in these biases, and they tell us who's likely to discriminate. So we assume that people who are higher on implicit biases, measures of implicit bias, are going to discriminate a lot, and those who are low in implicit bias are not. And so if we want to reduce discrimination, at least the part of discrimination that comes from unintended bias, then what we need to do is identify those individuals who are high in bias and either screen them out of decision-making roles, or to train them and rehabilitate their biases in some way to change their attitudes. There are a couple of problems with that view, though. One is that over the last few years, lots of research has been showing that when you look at individual differences in implicit bias and try to correlate them with behavioral measures of actual discrimination, those correlations are really low. They're not necessarily zero, but they're quite small, meaning that if you look at somebody's implicit bias score, whether it's with something like the implicit association test or some of the weapon-oriented implicit bias measures that Professor Eberhardt talked about, it's very difficult to predict who is going to actually discriminate and who's not going to. The second problem for that standard narrative around implicit bias is that implicit bias is not very stable at all. So in research studies, we talk about the test-retest correlation. In other words, if I give you an implicit bias test today and I give it to you another time 2 weeks from now, say, are you going to score in similar ways? And the answer is no. We can't predict very much about how you'll score in a couple of weeks based on how you score today. And that's a problem if you're thinking about implicit bias as an individual attitude that we carry around with us, because the people who score high today aren't necessarily the people who are going to score high tomorrow. And if that's the case, how do you expect to predict individual differences in discrimination? Now, some researchers have looked at those two kinds of data as a criticism of implicit bias measures or a criticism of the implicit bias concept itself, but there's a very different way to look at these data that puts this in a very different light. So if we look instead of individual differences and trying to characterize a person as high in implicit bias or low in implicit bias, if we instead start looking at social contexts that are relatively high or low in bias, in other words, the average level of implicit bias in different places and contexts, these data look very, very different. So what I'm showing you here is just two examples. On the left is a study that looked at the average gender bias linking male and female to science versus the liberal arts. And each data point on here is the average score for a country. And what's on the vertical axis is the actual male-female gender discrepancy in standardized tests in math and science for those countries. And what you find is that countries with a larger average implicit bias linking male to science have a much larger actual disparity in standardized test outcomes. And that's a very strong relationship. On the right, you see state level averages. So each data point here is one of the 50 states, and that's the state average on a race IAT measure of implicit bias. And on the vertical axis is the frequency of Google searches in that state for racist searches, search terms, or slurs. And here it's, again, an extremely strong correlation. You can predict with great accuracy, based just on knowing what the average implicit bias is in that state, how often people are Googling for racist search terms when they think they're in the privacy of their own home and on the privacy of their own computer. Again, a very strong relationship. And the final correlation I want to highlight here is looking at actual racial disparities in police use of deadly force. So this is data from Eric Heyman and colleagues. And what they find is that the average implicit association on the implicit association test at the city level, linking Black people and weapons relative to white people, is strongly associated with the racial disparity in actual police use of deadly force in that city. Now, if you think about this, these are data that come from Project Implicit, where millions of people go to take the implicit association test or other kinds of tests. And what these data are showing is that the average level of implicit bias from people that have nothing to do with you predict what kinds of outcomes you might have in these different cities. So this is not police officers going to this website and taking these tests. So if you're a Black person in one of these cities that has high levels of implicit bias, based on the implicit bias of other people, you're still more likely to be shot by police in that city than in a city with low levels of bias. And what this all suggests is that we need to think much more systematically about how implicit bias relates to places like cities and counties and states and workplaces, rather than just the people taking the tests. So my colleagues and I call this perspective the bias of crowds model of implicit bias. We argue that implicit bias works something like the wisdom of crowds, where an individual may not know the answer, but if you survey the answers to any kind of question like, how tall is the Statue of Liberty? If you ask 100 people for their guesses and then average them, it turns out to be really surprisingly accurate. And the reason is that each person has a little bit of partial uncertain knowledge and then uncertainty that's kind of random. Some people overestimate, some people underestimate. And if you average across those, what you get is an average answer that reflects the knowledge that's in that crowd. So implicit bias can work that way too. And the reason is that implicit associations that make the associations in our heads that link Black or white social groups to various stereotypes and ideas, they can vary both chronically as a function of the person, we carry them around with us in our head to some extent, but also temporarily as an aspect of the context. And what that means is that just like with the wisdom of crowds, this partial and fleeting knowledge in these associations, knowledge of stereotypes, can create robust, stable aggregates that converge on the level of bias in that context, even if no individual in that context actually holds that attitude or belief. And what that means is that implicit bias might be more informative about the context, in other words, the situations and the structures around us, than the individuals that inhabit them. And so that's a major shift in the way that we think about what implicit bias means and what we ought to do about it. So just to give you a concrete metaphor, instead of thinking about it as something in our heads, it suggests that implicit bias is a little bit more like the wave in a stadium, right? So when the wave starts going around in a stadium, when it gets to your section, you're likely to stand up and raise your hands, regardless of what you think about standing and cheering. Right? It's not existing in our heads, it's passing through us. It's a true social phenomenon. And so if we think about it like that, we need to stop asking, or not just ask questions about why are some people more biased and others less, but what kinds of settings create bias? And we can ask that at lots of different levels. And we need to be asking it at lots of different levels. I want to share with you some data that goes back to the most fundamental cause of this kind of bias that we could think of, which is the historical practice of slavery in the United States. So what I'm showing you here is a map that President Lincoln used in planning and strategizing in the run-up to the Civil War. This is data from the 1860 census, mapped onto a map at a county by county level. And the counties that are shaded darker have a larger percentage of their population enslaved in the 1860 census. Right? And what you can see here is it's not some just broad north-south difference. One county to the next varies a lot in terms of the enslaved population based on all sorts of factors related to agriculture and geology and geography. And now President Lincoln was using this to plan because he knew the states and areas that were more economically dependent on slavery were going to be more committed to secession. And he turned out to be right. The states seceded in almost exactly the same order as based on the proportion of their populations that were enslaved. And he also knew that border states that had less slavery, like Kentucky, Illinois, Maryland, Missouri and Maryland, could be more likely to be persuaded to stay in the Union because they were less economically dependent on slavery. All right, so he was using it for the purposes of planning for the war, but it turns out that the economic dependence on slavery in a very granular county by county level, as well as a state by state level, turned out to predict not only how committed these regions were to seceding in the Civil War, but those areas that were more economically dependent on slavery also created more intense Jim Crow laws. They created more intense racial segregation. To this day, they have more residential racial segregation, larger racial disparities in poverty and other kinds of modern day economic outcomes. So what we did is we took this data from this map and we basically created a digitized version of it. What you're seeing on the top here is a digitized version of that same map from the 1860 census. And on the bottom is the intensity of implicit bias from the Project Implicit website among white residents today. And the areas that are in white simply don't have enough data. So I don't know if you can see the relationship by just eyeballing it, but let me show it to you plotted a different way. On the left, you see a county by county association, and on the right, you see state level associations. And in both cases, you see that places that had a larger proportion of their population enslaved in 1860 have higher implicit bias today, over 160 years later. So I think that is fairly striking evidence that it's not just the individuals, none of whom are around from then, that carry around these implicit biases with us. It's the systems and structures around us. And so what is it that connects these enslaved populations in 1860 to modern day implicit bias? Well, it has to be something about the structures around us that are long lasting and slow to change. And so what we found was that if you look at measures of systemic racism, in other words, modern day disparities in poverty rates, modern day racial disparities in economic mobility rates, and modern day housing segregation, these are the mediators, the factors that connect slavery in 1860 to implicit bias today. In other words, places that had a lot of slavery in 1860 developed more systemic racism that is still detectable today. And it's those modern day systemic disparities that predict the average level of implicit bias today. So just to wrap up, to the extent that these tests reflect social context, we need to rethink some things, specifically the standard narrative of implicit bias as a personal attitude as opposed to systems and structures around us. Training to change people's individual biases, which has become very popular in recent years. I think we need to rethink that and instead focus on interventions that change situations and not people. And that means focusing on policies, procedures, power differentials in the systems around us, not just attitudes in our heads. So let me stop there, and thanks to all my collaborators, and turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me begin, as many of the other people on this panel have begun, by acknowledging the George Floyd killing, and sadly, there are very many other killings that have gone in the same direction in recent years. As both Jennifer and Phil have mentioned, a focus on racism and racial justice is a natural response to the situation because African Americans are more likely to be treated in the ways that they've laid out. But what I want to suggest is that policing in America is a problem for all Americans, even though Black Americans are the most strongly impacted by the police. My main points for this talk are several. One, the warrior culture of policing addresses problems from an era when high levels of violent crime characterized America. But today, violent crime is very low. So the warrior culture is a mismatch for the issues that contemporary police deal with. Furthermore, this culture hinders the ability of police officers to be effective in most of what they do today. So there are two solutions we might put forward. One is reorganize police agencies around a service model so that the police can better handle the tasks that they actually perform. The other is shrink the scope of policing and have many tasks that are now handled by the police handled by others. This is an ideal moment for us to think about this larger issue, to think about what the role of American police should be in our democratic society. And we need to begin by asking the question what communities think their problems are and how they would like to solve those problems. And I think consistent with the general theme of this panel, psychological science can both support and inform this process. Okay, so the previous speakers have already made it clear that there are widespread calls for changing policing. Phil did a great job of pointing out the many things that are potentially being done in different areas. A lot of policy changes are being recommended, strengthening officer accountability, removing problematic officers, mandating training. I think we have to be realistic and we have to point out that at this moment, at a national level, these policy changes are getting stopped. And it's not even clear if the George Floyd police reform bill will pass Congress. That doesn't mean the change isn't happening. And I'm not going to repeat what Phil Goff said. I think we're seeing change at a local level. What I think we want to emphasize is we need to move beyond surface policy changes, even if those changes are desirable, and consider the underlying organization of policing. And you can tell from my saying that I'm a social psychologist. But the point, I think, in the larger sense is that America has never had a discussion about what it really wants from its democratic policing. This is a discussion for everybody, not just for minorities. Okay, well, what's true of the police today? The police define their mission as harm reduction through crime control. They're trained and equipped to use force to compel compliance. They're basically warriors, and they describe themselves that way. But this framing of the police flows from an era of high crime. And the police have not changed to reflect the fact that crime is very low now. And I'm going to show you a figure. This is the rate of violent crime from 1990 to 2014, dramatic decline. Now, I know that you will have heard that there's a spike in violent crime, which there is. So if you look over on the side of the slide, I noted in 2020, there is a spike, but look where it puts violent crime compared to where it was in 1990. It puts it slightly above. So let's not overstate the spike. Crime is at historic low levels, and it remains that way. Okay, so that leads us to a mismatch where we have a warrior skill set that doesn't match what the police do all day. Their jobs seldom require them to be warriors. Estimates are 4% of their day involves tasks that require armed officers that are capable of dealing and deploying force, dealing with violence. What their job does require them to do is to be mental health workers, social workers, mediators, and lifestyle dispute managers. So what are the problems? One, the police don't have the training, the skill set to manage those problems, the one they actually encounter. And their training as warriors makes these situations worse because they bring a dominance, force-based orientation to all the situations they deal with, which spirals conflict and leads to many of the violent situations that we're all aware of today. So just to give you an example of recent research, what the police do all day in different cities, you'll see that across these cities, about 4% of the time, the police are dealing with violent crime. And all the other things don't require an armed police presence. Oops, okay. Well, what's the consequence of this warrior focus? What we see is that public trust in the police has dropped. And in 2020, a majority of adult Americans expressed distrust in their local police. Only 48% of Americans say they trust their local police, and trust among Black Americans is 37% lower. This is not an anomaly. We've seen for decades that about 60% of adult Americans trust the police. Now it's down to about 50%. So the strategy that's being used is not building police legitimacy. All right. Well, what do we want the police to do in response to this problem? One approach is for the police to change so that the officers can actually manage these other tasks that they actually perform. This requires culture change. The police need to rechange their mission. They need to rethink and move towards a service model. A different style of policing is required. So we need retraining, new policies and practices, and different reward and promotion approaches. All right. Well, how can psychology help with this? Psychology has trust-building models. The current hierarchical model of policing concentrates authority at the top and then pushes down that authority on the community. But psychological research suggests the value of inverting this authority structure, considering how people experience policing and what people think is desirable police behavior. The police have assumed that the style of policing that gets them approval is performance, but we're very clear in our research with psychologists in showing that what people primarily want is they want fair procedures from the police. They want to have voice, they want evidence of neutrality, they want treatment with courtesy and respect, and they want to feel that the officers that they deal with sincerely care about them and are trying to do the right thing. Okay, so we need to change police culture and develop this new model of policing, build public trust, train officers differently, and have a more consensual model. All right, but an alternative approach that also should be considered, and it's more like the Ithaca model that Phil already mentioned, is reimagining the concept of public safety. So an alternative approach is to lessen the police footprint in the community. We could bring the police into police stations and only have them deal with violent crime, where we actually need an armed police presence, and replace them with social workers, mental health workers, again, something that Phil mentioned several communities are already doing. I think one core problem with this is that although crime is down substantially, police forces have not downsized. So they have a lot of resources that we would have to reallocate, and this is a political issue. Let me just give one example here. As you saw, crime has dropped dramatically. Violent crime is about 25% what it was in 1990. The number of police officers in America is the same as it was in 1990. So a lot of resources are going to create a service for a problem that doesn't really exist anymore. And those resources are the resources that could be reallocated to produce the social services that Phil was talking about. Okay, so we need to shift the conversation to building vital communities. If the police manage the conversation, then they talk about how to control crime. But the absence of harm is not the same thing as the presence of vitality. Community members need to be asked what the needs of their community are and how they would like to see them addressed. This can be collaborative with the police, but the police can't control it, as they so often do, and it has to include traditionally excluded voices. Okay, so what can psychology contribute? Models of deliberation. We know how stakeholders can work together to reimagine their communities. We can demonstrate the value of community deliberation. If we want economic, social, and political vitality, we need engagement and identification. Those things are built by collective deliberation. And finally, we need to identify models of well-being. We need to talk about what a good community looks like, not just the absence of crime, but the presence of vitality. Psychology has those models. Okay. All right. So finally, then how can we combat racism in policing? The theme of this panel. Change the style of policing so that the police connect with the community, they're less likely to express bias and less likely to use force. Emphasize positive goals for the police beyond harm reduction, and change the role of the police in the community, recognizing that you cannot arrest your way out of crime. The police have to work with everyone else for community development as a long-term mechanism for lowering crime. Thank you.
I'd like to start off with a general question for the panel, and that is, what role does incentivizing arrests have on police behavior?
I just start with that, and then other people could also respond. The whole system of policing incentivizes police officers to focus on trying to arrest people, because if you want to be successful as a police officer, you need an arrest record. That's how people are viewed as good police. And in particular, the whole warrior mentality is you're fighting crime. So how do you show that you're good at your job is through arrests. So I think it's absolutely true that one of the things we always talk about with culture change is, instead of the police officer with the most arrests being the one whose picture is on the wall as officer of the month, how about the police officer who has the best relationship with the community? That would change what police officers think a good police officer looks like. That person should be promoted. And then officers will start to see that the way to get ahead as a police officer is through building good relationships with the community, not through arresting people.
I do want to just interrupt. Philip has to go, and I asked him if he has any final comments that he would like to add after hearing the rest of the presentations.
As always, I am smarter for having listened to my colleagues, and to both your question to all of us and following up on Tom's response. I don't think we can overstate how crushing it can be to live in a community where it's obvious that the people are disposable. I listen oftentimes to communities where we work, and they talk about being referred to as throwaway people. And one of the ways that we can combat that is simply to do as Tom is suggesting, but even on a grander scale, measure the things that actually matter. In the context of public safety, we've only ever measured crime. We've never measured anything like justice. That's why our interventions are well received by communities, is because for the first time we're saying, oh, we're going to measure what the state does to you. We have never measured once on a national level what the armed representatives of the state, empowered to take away life and liberty, do in the communities that are majority made up of the children, the descendants, formerly enslaved people. If we cared about the legacy of what we have done to Black folks in this country, there's no way we wouldn't even bother to measure the thing. It's not what we as psychologists often think about. But if we remember that we're supposed to be doing not just attitudes, but behaviors as well, which you've been hearing throughout all 4 presentations, we could rededicate ourselves to getting some of those measures of behavior right and figuring out the right ways to use those to measure impact. So again, for the psychologists listening, if you can hear the sound of my voice, behavior out in the world, it matters a great deal. And from Kurt Lewin to Jennifer Eberhardt, we shouldn't shrink away from going and doing the difficult work of finding the ways to measure that and putting that within our theories, giving that back to communities. I'm so sorry I have to go, but this is a wonderful, wonderful event. I'm so glad to have been a part of it. Thank you all.
I do have a question, and this may be for Keith, but certainly anyone can jump in. And the question is, can we say that physical contexts, i.e. monuments or neighborhoods that still reflect segregation, are part of the social context that contributes to systemic racism and implicit bias? Is it possible that these physical contexts provide cues that influence police prejudice actions?
Right. So what we can say right now is that they're correlated. So we have, I showed you one study showing the physical aspects such as housing segregation are correlated with the level of implicit bias in a community. We've done other studies looking at implicit bias across different college campuses. And we looked at what we considered markers of sort of concrete markers of systemic racism at a campus level. And those things that were associated with the level of implicit bias on those campuses were things like the presence of Confederate statues, so part of the built environment, and also the amount of faculty diversity, so the representation of diverse faculty members, but also, you know, people with power on campus who are people of color. So those concrete aspects of the setting that we've looked at so far are at least correlated with the level of implicit bias. I don't think we can say yet that they're necessarily the causes, because it's bound up with lots of other things going on in the culture. But this is all fairly new research, and that's one of the big questions out there. What are the aspects of the literal context around us that are transmitting those biases?
You know, another researcher, Buju Dasgupta, has looked at this in terms of gender, where you have, you know, you're looking at students who are at an all-women's college, and you find that they have gender bias that is pretty similar to the rest of the population when they walk in the door as freshmen. But then over time, as they spend more time in this other context where they see, you know, women professors, they see women leaders in STEM and so forth, that bias changes the longer they stay. So that's another example of the same kind of thing we're talking about, but looking at gender.
Seeing as that we are running a bit over time, I want to finish off with one question, and I'll begin by answering it, but this was actually presented to us. That is, what steps would you suggest individuals take in response to this, to learning about your research findings? And I'll start off by saying that on our website, psychologicalscience.org, we do have research topics. One of them is policing, where you can look at some background and additional research done on this topic. But to wrap things up, would each panelist just like to recommend kind of where to go next for information? Where would you recommend that journalists look for the latest research?
Well, I was probably remiss when I started by not saying that I'm a member of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School, which has a website, which is a perfect repository for a lot of this information. If anybody wants to see articles, wants to see different policy statements, I would recommend going to the Justice Collaboratory website at Yale Law School as an example.
I also am a part of a group called SPARQ, which Charles mentioned earlier on, and we are a group of researchers who work in collaboration with practitioners to address significant social issues, and one of those issues has to do with criminal justice and policing. So going to the SPARQ website, site is SPARQ.org. You can get information there, and then I believe there are going to be some of the members of SPARQ who will be involved with producing a backgrounder for this. And so there'll be more information for others who want to know more there. Thanks.
And I'll point out, because Jennifer is too modest, she has a fabulous book called Biased that you can see that summarizes much of her research on this and broader topics. I also have a book to plug. It's called The Broken Ladder. It talks about the psychology of inequality broadly, and includes racial inequality as part of that. So check those out as well.
With those wonderful references in mind, I would like to thank our panelists and participants for today. There will be a transcript of this conversation and also a video that will be available on the website, and I will send an email to all participants and panelists when that's available. And if you have any questions, you should all have my email. Feel free to contact me directly. I'm happy to put you in touch with anyone or to follow up with anything that needs additional information. So thank you very much. Again, I appreciate your time.